Fáilte. Welcome to the Village Oak Tree. I'm your host, Terrance Ó Domhnaill. Thank you for joining me again this week. The United States is at a crossroads in its history. There's a major fight going on for control and its soul. I have a couple of news stories from around the world about corruption and greed in the highest places, the state of the EU, and some intel from the war in Ukraine. Plus a report on the shadow fleet vexing world leaders as they try to control the flow of oil to their advantage. So gather around, sit you down somewhere comfortable for a bit, while I bring you some more stories from the world outside your village. I picked out a couple more news stories this week that just show how corrupt people are across the world. We're all very aware now of just how corrupt Trump and his family are, but they are by no means the only grifters out there. It's just that Trump keeps stealing the spotlight. Ukrainian government, I've got this story here. Ukrainian government has long been accused of corruption. And this latest scandal is just one example of so many, especially since all these Western countries decided to start giving them billions in order to fight the Russians after they rolled across the border in February 2022. There have been lots of news stories reporting that a vast portion of all that money is sitting in offshore bank accounts owned by the Ukrainian oligarchs, disguised as military defense contractors, and arguably Zelensky himself. There have been multiple stories over the past couple of years about these government officials and their patrons getting busted and fired for their corruption. But like any house full of cockroaches, you can get rid of some, but it's the ones that you don't see you have to worry about. Here in the United States, they're not even bothering to hide under the sinks and the walls anymore. Trump is the king of the corrupt cockroaches, and he has given them all the license to run around in broad daylight to do as they please. And they are, daring anyone to do anything about it. In Europe, the political and economic instability has been giving fuel to the more extreme right-wing political groups in the last few years, but it's also giving rise to more sophisticated crime sprees. I found one article regarding violence for hire now. Seems that in the EU, you can hire people to commit violence for you for whatever political reason you want and blame it on whoever you want. I imagine the Israelis are all over this. Those recent outbreaks in Germany carried out by so-called extremists, maybe not extremists. These alleged perpetrators may have just been paid to commit violent acts for political reasons. Apparently, it's a growing business model in Europe right now. Desperate times get desperate acts for money. This is nothing new in history. This kind of political disruption has been going on since the beginning of the first city governments arrived in the ancient world. It's easy to find someone willing to commit violence to support a cause when they're desperate for a few coins to buy their next meal from or whatever. The difference in this business model is that it's just that, a thriving business. These people have figured out another way to cash in on people's misery in Europe. And misery it is. I listened to another podcast last week from my favorite Austrian. And she reports that the governments in the EU are getting so desperate to find money to fight the Russians with that they're very willing to sacrifice social programs and their economies to pay for a very much expanded defense budget. Germany especially, which is spilling over into smaller countries like Austria. To give people an idea of just how Russophobic these countries are, here's an example of this war against anything Russia that is taking place in Germany and Austria. Here we go. So just to give you an idea here, a little background, Germany has been in recession for a couple of years now. But instead of addressing that, the German government constantly pushes for more EU funds to send to Ukraine. They're now doing everything they can think of to build up their military at the expense of their people. For them, the war in Ukraine has become existential. If you ask the average citizen on the street, they have a different opinion. Germany is just one example of how Europe and the EU is collapsing under the massive expenses they have incurred under the American security umbrella, that Trump has now largely taken away and is threatening more. Now, in years past, they didn't have to spend a lot of money on self-defense. But now that Trump has taken away their warm, fuzzy security blanket, they're exposed to the cold, cruel war for the first time since the end of World War II. And they realize that they're nearly naked in that cold as they scramble to try and buy warmer clothes with no money. Doesn't help their cause when these European politicians who are old enough to remember the Cold War days and maybe had parents or grandparents who fought in World War II are so afraid of the Russians that they're ready to use whatever they can to dispel their irrational fear of this imaginary Russian invasion they think is coming, if they don't beat back the Russians on Ukrainian soil. This fear is so all-consuming for some of them, they can't see what the Ukrainians are doing with all those euros and dollars that they're being given to them. Not that I think Trump is a good person by any means, but scaling back military aid money to the corrupt Ukrainians may not be such a bad idea. Once the Russians win on the battlefield, and by all predictions I've been listening to lately, may very well be this year, all of the Ukrainian grift will come to light, as Russia has vowed to expose it all once they've taken control of the Donbass region and secured Kiev, which is Putin's stated mission objective. Some are arguing that Ukraine has stepped up their game with the new drone technology, and it may be so. But then I've seen reports from Europe and Russia of emaciated frontline Ukrainian soldiers who haven't had enough food and water for quite some time now. You can have all the best drones in the world, but without soldiers to operate the controls or stop the Russian infantry from running all over the battlefields, they're only a band-aid on the overall war zone. Ukraine is slowly losing this war of attrition. I heard stories last year that this was the master battle plan, to starve and whittle down Ukrainian infantry to the point of non-existence. The Russians seem to have the men and materials to do that with. Although I'm also hearing other stories that Russia may have overextended itself a little bit in both war materials and manpower, not to mention the popularity of this special military operation is starting to wear a little thin with the average Russians. Not that they can vote for anything and have it make a difference. Public opinion can still sway decisions in the Duma and turn Putin if enough grumbling is heard. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens during the year over there. It's early May, so the roads and fields are still wet with snowmelt and muddy. I saw a Facebook page showing a lake in the far north of Maine, but still has enough ice left in it to hold a snowmobile yet. Ukraine and Russia are like that as well right now. There's probably still snow in the woods yet and mud everywhere, which makes it harder for the military vehicles to gain ground quickly due to the muddy conditions. But once things dry out for the summer months, we can expect major gains despite Ukraine drones firing on oil refineries and other civilian infrastructure in Western Russia. Here they're even reaching Moscow now. Ukraine should never have listened to the Europeans and the Americans back in 2022 when they were thinking of meeting Russia to negotiate a deal. Now they stand to lose everything, or at the very least, nearly a third of their territory, and end up with a Russian subservient government. But then, given the current state of disarray in the EU and NATO in general, that might be a better deal these days. The EU seems to be close to dissolving, according to some sources I've read. They'll never admit it until the end. But with Germany's economy collapsing, taking Austria and maybe Belgium's with it, that doesn't leave many core nations left to hold it together. France is heavily in debt. So is Italy. France is a shadow, quaking in its boots at every sharp retort made in their direction. They sit quietly on the Mediterranean and ask how high whenever anyone in Brussels says jump. Otherwise, they sit out of sight, out of mind, unless someone needs something. And I mean anyone. Most of us are aware that Israel attacked the global Sumud flotilla off the coast of Cyprus last week, about 600 miles outside their territorial waters around the far eastern Mediterranean. Deliberate attack in someone else's territorial waters, in this case, Greece. who meekly helped the Israelis out of fear. Two of the most prominent activists are on trial in Israel right now. Gods only know what will happen to them. Given past history of previous pirated activists, such as the captured flotilla last fall, when those detainees were beaten and sexually humiliated, such as Ms. Greta Thunberg, these two men are probably in for a rough time in an Israeli prison until their governments can manage to get them out. One of them is from Spain, and the other is from Brazil. In a report from Chris Hedges last Sunday evening in the news from Israel, these two foreign nationals captured and taken to Israel have been arraigned in an Israeli court after being severely beaten and tortured on the boat to Israel. The court has extended their incarceration. In other words, they're being treated like Palestinian prisoners, which those of us who have been paying attention to these things for the last couple of years know is what these two men will likely face now. More torture and abuse, and possibly a long detention. And at the worst, disappeared into the Israeli prison system. As I replied to this article, their governments are condemning this. Their governments are condemning this, as they should. But public condemnation won't bring them home anytime soon. Israel doesn't care what the world thinks because they know they can do anything they want to anyone they want anywhere in the world. And they have all the politicians around the world so scared of them to deter them from fighting back in any really meaningful way. So Spain and Brazil can say anything they want within the public world sphere, but Israel will keep giving the world the middle finger and do as they please. No one is courageous enough to actually stand up to Israel, and they know it. As it is, those 170 plus others from around the world that were dropped off on an island off the coast of Greece after some of them were beaten by the IDF enough to warrant medical care, then treated like criminals by the pissing in their pants Greeks. Some have been sent to Istanbul and released, to my knowledge. As of Monday, some have arrived in the Netherlands. As for the rest of the EU, they remain together on shaky ground these days. Finland has gone to a war posture on their border with Russia. Estonia is contemplating merging with Romania for protection from the Russians, and other Eastern European countries are looking more at Russia for oil and economic stress relief. They certainly aren't getting any help from Brussels anymore. If anything, the EU Council has made things worse for them by shutting off the Russian oil imports. Adding to their economic woes is the closing of the Straits of Hormuz by the United States. There are a few ships getting through, though, but some of them are part of this sanctioned shadow fleet that Russia is using to move its oil around the world. As I mentioned last week, they use electronic subterfuge to sneak by the American blockade with the permission of the Iranians. Some are moving Iranian crude to Asian markets, mostly China, and others are paying the new tolls imposed by the Iranians in order to move their cargoes to countries that Iran deems not a belligerent in this war with Israel and U.S. I read, and this is an article that I found, since the Americans don't have near enough ships to effectively blockade the straits, some are managing to break out. Not near enough to alleviate the oil woes for the rest of the world, but the Asian countries are seeing a small benefit. So is India and other Southwest Asian countries. I read last weekend that China is thumbing its nose at the new U.S. sanctions on its teapot oil refineries and banks. The Chinese government in Beijing has told them to carry on, not be afraid of the Americans. I haven't heard a peep out of Washington yet. Maybe Trump is afraid to make too many moves ahead of his visit to China later this month. Given how mercurial Trump's temperament is these days, no one truly knows what Washington will do about this, if anything. If they do anything, China may get a pass. Not that Beijing cares one whit what Trump does anymore, unless it directly affects them. And as long as China is getting its oil, they don't really care. I also read a post on Facebook recently, which I haven't read in any of the news media from around the world. It said China is starting to provide naval military escorts for their cargo ships transiting to and from the Persian Gulf. If so, I'm willing to bet a little sum that Trump has told his boy Hegseth to pass on to the U.S. Navy to let them go through. The U.S. is most definitely not in a position to challenge China on the open seas or anywhere else for that matter. The downside is that no matter whose ships are being let through, it's nowhere near enough to alleviate the world's oil demands, even China's. Not that China is worried about oil shortages yet, because they have the massive Russian pipeline and lots of reserves stored up for rainy days like this. That and they don't use nearly as much oil as they used to. They foresaw a day when the Gulf oil would become a fought over commodity, and they took steps years ago to prevent themselves from being too dependent on other countries for much of anything, especially energy. Not that they still aren't taking a small hit, but nowhere near as much as the rest of the world. In the United States, things are starting to become dire in certain states, with petrol and diesel prices surging upwards to nearly $5 and more. Canada is still working hard to divest themselves from the U.S. At the same time, they're still making deals that benefit themselves more than before. Trump signed off on another Canadian oil pipeline from Alberta, Canada to Wyoming last week. The Canadians are gearing up for a contentious CUSMA treaty negotiation coming up this summer. That ought to draw a lot of attention around the world. I pay attention to some Canadian news, and they're worried, but now more determined not to let Trump bully them into trade deals that will hurt their economy. Their PM, Mark Carney, is holding firm, despite some opposition from the Canadian Conservative Party. I don't want to get into their politics here, just to say they have a long way to go in order to be fully independent of Trump's America, and they know it. Some of the more rural provinces are hurting economically, while others are managing better, such as Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia. And that's something that will take a while to equal out, especially if the Liberal government can continue to sell more oil to Asia and Europe, plus a lot of other commodities that the Americans have tariffed. The rest of the world is slowly stepping away from trading with the U.S. these days because of all that instability. It will never be a complete embargo, but a major slowdown is coming, unless the people in the U.S. can figure out a way to curb Trump and his mafia associates and then reach back out to everyone with reassurances that things will get better now that the tyrant is gone for good. Unfortunately for the American people, this will take many, many months, maybe even years, to repair the trust Trump has lost with traders from around the world. The blinders have come off. They see the Americans for who they truly are, and it will take a whole lot of eating humble pie, to quote an American saying, to repair the damage to America's reputation, if they ever do. I personally don't think the United States is ever going to fully recover from the economic collapse that Trump has and is continuing to push. After all, himself and his wealthy friends and associates will make billions off of the collapse by buying up distressed companies and real estate once the values reach a certain low point, just as they did back in the 1930s and every other economic collapse since. Something I learned from reading Tom Hartman's newsletters. Their forefathers made bank until FDR stopped them with his New Deal, but we haven't seen any Republican president since who would stand up and maintain these standards. Now, they're all but gone under Trump. I remarked on someone's newsletter a few days ago that with the U.S. Supreme Court eviscerating the Voting Rights Act, it is becoming even more conceivable the United States will likely break apart along ideological lines at some point in the next 20 to 25 years. The current political situation is not sustainable, and I believe that something is going to give. I don't think a Democratic takeover of the Congress in 2026 is going to make a huge difference anymore. The white people in the southern states are nearly ready to secede once again if they can figure out how to survive without federal money. And if they do, the rest of the country will follow soon after, all into their own little autonomous regions. This latest decision by the court may turn into the catalyst for these southern states who want the freedom to do as they please, starting with Louisiana and Texas, then Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Missouri, West Virginia, and the two Carolinas. Virginia may become a battleground state, as they will be closely divided between the stays and the ghosts. I think we're a ways off from all that yet, but there are more and more people talking about this now. If things don't find a way to work themselves out, certain states will start taking matters into their own hands. Some already are in certain instances. California and Minnesota, to name a couple, and Louisiana in the South to start after last week. And if successful over the next few months, this will embolden the rest to follow suit. All of which may have a huge impact on the presidential elections in 2028. I have a bad feeling about that. I'm expecting to see a whole lot of fighting between states and political parties for control of the country. And that will set the tone for the future of the United States going forward. It's not so much who will get elected, but how. Whether it's a free and fair election, which is starting to look real iffy right now. Chris Armitage, who writes the Existential Republic newsletter, keeps advocating for states to implement what he calls a soft secession against the federal government in order to protect states' sovereign rights. A good idea, except for one thing. If states start doing that, a lot of them, such as the southern and western states, will take that as their cue to soft secede in a different way than the northern states and the West Coast states. And then there goes the Union, split along ideological lines. What do you think? Do you still think the United States can remain together with its 50 states still intact after 2028? Will the rest of the world continue slowing down their trade with the mafia-run government? How would you handle living in an impoverished United States once it can no longer pay its debts and goes bankrupt? Remember, Americans have a president who has bankrupted many companies in his past and wants to run the United States like a corporation. Take a look around you and think about that. Is Trump repeating his own business history at everyone else's expense? It's time to take my break. Listen to my short commercial, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes to tell you about a movie I recently watched that describes a very real possible future of the U.S. by 2065. During this break, I want to take a couple of minutes to explain how you can support this podcast. One way is to become a paid subscriber on my Substack page. As you can see here, you can also find the Village Oak Tree on medium.com. And again, you can find it on YouTube, where this is the Village Oak Tree YouTube channel, and you can like and subscribe there as well. This podcast is also available on mobile audio podcasts all over the world, such as RSS, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so many more. The best way is to make a donation or buy a book through my website, which you can visit using the QR code in the top left corner of this video. And on this page, I accept donations of any amount in most currencies around the world using Stripe. The website address is also listed in the scrolling banner at the bottom of your screen. If you're listening to an audio version of this podcast and one of the many mobile apps available, use the link in the podcast description. I've made the website more mobile friendly to view, so go check it out. I hope people watching or listening to this podcast or just reading the commentary on Substack or medium.com will take a moment and come visit with me at crownofbeha.com. Might even have something you like and you want to come back for more. Sláinte. Welcome back. So, what I want to talk about today is I recently watched a movie on Netflix called The Creator. So I'm going to pull up a screenshot of the movie, the description of the movie that I got from Netflix. And I will tell you straight up, it's a science fiction movie. Okay. And, not everybody's into science fiction. I get that. But here's what I will tell you. That in watching this, it's not so much the characters and all that, because I will tell you, there's a lot of, whoever did the research for this movie didn't do a very good job. I will tell you that straight up. It's not the best quality as far as it goes. But what struck me when I got to the end of the movie was that whoever wrote the story for this movie really pretty much had what a possible future is spot on. So let me kind of give you a kind of a summary here. All right. So the movie takes place in 2065. And according to the story, the big thing about this whole scenario is that AI is taken over everywhere, all over the world. All right. Um, Mankind has created robots. They're all self-thinking, artificial intelligence, the whole 9 yards. Well, the Americans by 2065 had, previously before that, as I say 10 years or so before this, got all upset because AI was taking over their culture, all that kind of stuff. And they decided they didn't want it anymore. Well, they went to war with all these robots, did everything they could, destroy them, kick them out of the country, so on and so forth. Well, the problem was, like typical Americans, that wasn't good enough for them. They had to make a what I call to use an Islamic term, a jihad against AI around the world. So in this movie, the Americans are going all over the world with their high technology, and they're trying to erase all of these artificial intelligent robots and machinery and everything across the world. They're going into Asia, everywhere, and that's what the whole movie's all about. So I'm not gonna talk about the rest of that. But what I wanted to talk about mostly was the story itself. Is that according to this story, by 2065, artificial intelligence will be an integral part of society around the world. I don't really pretend to understand how that would all work out for everybody, and so on and so forth. But it's not inconceivable, though. I mean, really, we could possibly see that. They're in, as we can see from, if you pay attention to any news from overseas, China right now is starting to build robots. Japan is starting to get in on that. And it won't be too much longer before we start seeing actual humanoid type robots doing small things for people, probably in my lifetime, and I'm old enough to not have that much left. But probably within my lifetime, we're start gonna see that. Okay, so imagine what that's going to be like in 25 years. How much more of that will we see integrated with societies around the world? Now, I could definitely see that in China and Japan and probably South Korea, as for sure. Western countries, well, we know how the United States is, and Europe to a lesser degree. They're going to get all upset, probably on religious ideological grounds. Okay, a lot of these what I call far right Christian groups are going to be all upset because now they're railing about immigrants now. Well, imagine what they're going to be saying about robots. So you can get an idea of where I'm coming from here. But the biggest takeaway I got from this movie was how the United States reacted to all of this by, as usual, going around the world saying that we're the boss of the world. Everybody has to do what we say. We have the best technology. And if you don't do what we say, we're going to destroy you. Okay. We're doing that right now in 2026. So can you imagine if the United States is still a viable country similar to what it is like right now? Yeah, I could absolutely see the United States still doing this for the next 50 years. Absolutely. And that's my lesson of the day, is that, do we really, really need to want to let the United States continue to bully the world and let them do whatever they want just because they think they're the biggest and baddest in the world? Truthfully, I think the rest of the world needs to step up and say, all right, you're done here. Okay, go home, sit down. You're done. We're done playing with you. So that's my lesson of the day. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I appreciate you coming by. Gorma Hagen. Thank you for listening and watching and listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it. You'll return again to listen to me offer a voice to what a lot of people are thinking these days. Let's say goodbye this week. And let me take this off. To say goodbye this week, I'll leave you with this quote from the late George Bernard Shaw. Power does not corrupt men. Fools, however, if they get into a position of power, corrupt power. Slán go foiil.